There's a pond in Florida. It sits quietly inside a suburban neighborhood, surrounded by ordinary houses, children playing, cars coming and going. Nothing about it looks remarkable. Nothing about it demands your attention. But beneath the surface of that water, beneath the peat, beneath the silence, beneath 8,000 years of undisturbed darkness, lies a secret so profound, so deeply unsettling, that the world's most respected scientists still cannot fully explain it. And the strangest part? This secret was almost destroyed by a backhoe before anyone even knew it existed. What the DNA pulled from this place revealed did not just rewrite a chapter of history, it shattered the entire book. And the question that nobody in mainstream science is rushing to answer is this: if these people were not who we thought they were, then who exactly were they? And where did they go? In the heart of Central Florida, beneath the still tannin-stained waters of a seemingly ordinary pond, lies one of the most haunting archaeological discoveries in North America. The pond is called Windover Pond. It rests near Titusville, Florida, roughly halfway between Disney World and Cape Canaveral, two symbols of modern American ambition. And yet, what sleeps beneath its waters predates both by thousands of years. For 8 millennia, it held its silence. It gave nothing away. It breathed quietly beneath the subtropical sky while empires rose and fell, while languages were born and died, while the entire recorded history of human civilization played out on the surface above it. Then, on an unremarkable morning in 1982, a backhoe operator named Steve Vanderjagt changed everything. Vanderjagt was clearing the pond area for a new housing development. He was doing his job, moving earth, pressing forward, and then his machine pulled something from the mud. He stopped. He looked at the object in his hands. 2 empty eye sockets stared back at him. It was a human skull. His first thought, reportedly, was simply raw shock. But what he did next determined whether this discovery would live or die. He could have buried it. He could have quietly covered the bones and pressed forward with construction. Nobody would have known. The deadline would have been met, the houses would have been built, and one of the most important archaeological sites in the entire history of the Americas would have been crushed under concrete and forgotten forever. But Vanderjagt stopped. He stepped away from the machine, he made the call, and the world, though it did not know it yet, would never be the same. Since its discovery, this small, peat-bottomed pond situated roughly between Cape Canaveral and Disney World in east central Florida has offered up no fewer than 168 burials. But here is what stopped scientists cold the moment they arrived on site. These were not just bones. These were not the crumbling remnants of forgotten people. The remains, together with artifacts that looked like they had been deposited yesterday, including bone tools, a bottle gourd, and woven fabric shrouds, offered a rare portrait of life in an ancient hunter-gatherer-fisher community. Think about what that means. Items that should have rotted into dust thousands of years before the Roman Empire existed were pulled from this Florida pond looking almost fresh. The bog had not just slowed decay, it had essentially stopped time itself. And that is where the first layer of the mystery begins to peel back. Because the conditions that created this preservation were not accidental. They were not random. The peat in Windover Pond created an oxygen-free environment, preventing the typical decay that occurs when bodies are buried in soil. An anaerobic environment, one without oxygen, is essentially nature's version of a sealed vault. Add to that the remarkably stable pH balance of the water, the constant temperature of the submerged peat, and the sheer depth at which these bodies were placed, and you have the precise conditions required to preserve not just bone, not just fabric, not just wood, but something far more extraordinary, something that no scientist expected to find, something that, when they discovered it, caused several researchers to stop working entirely and simply stare. The presence of brain matter in 91 of the bodies suggests that they were buried quickly, within 48 hours of death. 91 human brains, still inside their skulls, still structurally intact. After 8,000 years, the brains were so perfectly preserved at a microscopic level that scientists could see cell structure, individual cells. In brains that had been sitting at the bottom of a Florida pond since before the Egyptian pyramids were even a concept in anyone's mind. Before Stonehenge, before the wheel was widely used, before writing existed anywhere on Earth, these cells were still visible. And if cells were visible, that meant something else was possible too. Something that had never been done before in the Americas. Something that would take years to attempt and would ultimately produce results that nobody was prepared for. The DNA was still there. Now, to understand why this matters so deeply, you have to understand what ancient DNA is and what it is not. It is not like the DNA you would find in a living person. It is fragmented. It is damaged. It is degraded by time in ways that make it extraordinarily difficult to read, to sequence, to interpret. In most archaeological sites, even sites far younger than Windover, organic material simply does not survive. The heat, the moisture, the oxygen, they destroy everything. Finding intact brain tissue in skulls that are 8,000 years old is nearly unheard of in archaeology, which means finding extractable, analyzable DNA inside that brain tissue, and inside the bones themselves, was not just a scientific breakthrough. It was, by any honest measure, a miracle of circumstance. The bog had done what no laboratory could have engineered, and when scientists finally cracked the code of what that DNA contained, everything they thought they knew about the earliest Americans came apart at the seams. But before we get to the DNA results, and we will because they are extraordinary, we need to understand who these people were in life. Because the DNA tells us one story, but the burial site tells us another. And together, these two stories form something that does not fit neatly into any existing narrative about prehistoric North America. Nearly 200 separate intact burials were excavated at the Windover site. With only a couple of exceptions, the bodies had been ritualistically buried and placed in the same fetal position, lying on the left side. The heads were pointed west, with their faces to the north. This was not random. This was not convenience. Every single burial was positioned with deliberate, consistent care. Every body was oriented in the same direction, placed in the same posture, treated with the same ritualistic precision. This was a culture with rules. This was a culture with beliefs. This was a culture that had developed a fully formed, deeply held spiritual framework around the concept of death, and they had been practicing it in this same pond for generations. And here is where it gets profoundly strange. The deceased were wrapped in what archaeologists believe is the oldest existing woven fabric in the world. Read that again. The oldest woven fabric found in the New World. Not the oldest in Florida, not the oldest in North America, the oldest fabric. Textiles woven from plant fibers, some showing intricate patterns, some showing evidence of dyeing, ever discovered in the Americas. These amazingly well-preserved remains were determined to be between 7,000 and 8,000 years old, making them 3,200 years older than King Tutankhamun and 2,000 years older than the Great Pyramid of Egypt. 2,000 years older than the Great Pyramid. The people buried at Windover Pond were weaving sophisticated patterned fabric, while the builders of one of humanity's greatest monuments were still centuries away from being born. The textiles were crafted primarily from local plant fibers, such as palmetto, which were processed through retting and twisting to create strong, flexible threads. Weaving techniques at Windover demonstrate sophisticated fiber arts, featuring twined, plain, and twill weaves, all produced using hand-spun yarns without evidence of mechanical looms. Some fragments show evidence of plant-based dyeing, adding color and possibly symbolic value to the items. This was not primitive craft. This was not simple, unsophisticated work. The people of Windover were producing textiles with multiple weave types, with deliberate color application, with functional and decorative intent simultaneously. They were creating art and utility in the same object. They had a level of cultural and technological sophistication that the standard narrative of prehistoric North America simply does not account for. Many of the bodies were wrapped in textiles woven from plant fibers, then bound with cord and wooden stakes to keep them submerged in the shallow water at the edge of the pond. Individuals were buried with grave goods that appear to have been carefully chosen to reflect their status and identity in life. These included atlatls, carved wooden artifacts, shell and stone tools, jewelry, and woven bags filled with implements. A few burials contained particularly rare items like a puma bone pin and a shark tooth knife. A puma bone pin, a shark tooth knife. Items of status, items of identity, items that speak to a society in which individuals held different ranks, different roles, different levels of prestige. This was not a band of wandering survivors scraping together an existence. This was a community, organized, ritualistic, stratified, and sophisticated enough to have assigned meaning to specific objects, and to carry those objects into death as markers of who they were in life. Several branches were lashed together to form a tripod that held each body submerged underwater, creating a pond cemetery. Think about the engineering in that. Think about the deliberate choice, not just to bury the dead in this pond, but to construct wooden apparatuses to ensure the bodies stayed submerged at the precise depth required. This was not improvised. This was planned. This was a technology of a burial that required knowledge, tools, materials, and coordinated labor, and it was repeated consistently for over a century. DNA tests on the ancient remains proved that the same families used the site as a burial ground for more than a century. Generations of the same family lines returned to the same pond, the same water, this same ritual space, to bury their dead in the same way. Windover Pond was not a cemetery of convenience. It was a sacred site, a pilgrimage, a place so important to these people that they traveled to reach it time and again across an entire century of human lives. Radioisotopic analysis was used to measure traces of chemicals in the bones to give insight into their diet. This technology provided evidence to suggest that Windover was not their home. The people buried here were nomadic, traveling around the Florida peninsula. So they did not live here. They came here specifically to bury their dead. They moved across the Florida landscape. hunting, fishing, gathering, living, and when one of their people died, they brought that person to this specific pond, wrapped in their finest fabric, surrounded by their most valued possessions, and they placed them in the water with care and ceremony and the kind of spiritual intention that only comes from a deeply held belief in what happens after death. It had been a bountiful autumn for the people who lived near Florida's Atlantic coast more than 7,000 years ago. They had harvested prickly pears, sedge, hickory, and chestnuts in the subtropical forests. They had fished the sea, streams, and lakes with nets and bone hooks, catching catfish and sharks and collecting shellfish. In the forests, they had hunted opossum, rabbits, and deer. This was a world of abundance. Florida, 8,000 years ago, was not the Florida of today, but it was rich in food and water and the resources that a hunter-gatherer community needed to thrive. And these people were thriving. Forensics show that some Windover men stood at nearly 6 feet, and their bone density reveals that they were healthy, nearly 6 feet tall. Exceptional bone density. These were not malnourished survivors. These were physically powerful people living in relative abundance with complex social structures, sophisticated material culture, and a spiritual worldview sophisticated enough to generate one of the most elaborate burial systems ever discovered in prehistoric North America. And then the DNA results came back, and the story changed entirely. This is where everything changes. This is the point at which the Windover site stopped being a remarkable discovery and became a genuine scientific puzzle, one that leading researchers have been wrestling with ever since, and one that mainstream archaeology has struggled to fit into the accepted story of how and when humans first arrived in the Americas. An analysis of DNA extracted from the skeletal remains yielded the most interesting results. Conducted decades after the excavation, the study revealed that the people buried at Windover migrated to North America from Asia, but do not seem to be related to any living Native American tribes or to any known prehistoric peoples. They came from Asia, but they are not Native American in any genetic sense that modern science can connect to any living group. They are not related to any tribe, any lineage, any population currently on Earth. They are, in the most precise scientific language available, genetically isolated, genetically singular, a population that existed, flourished, buried their dead with extraordinary care, and then, completely and utterly, disappeared. DNA analysis of the remains shows that these bodies share no biological affiliation with the more modern Native American groups known to have lived in the area. None. Zero overlap with any group that came after them. The people who buried their dead at Windover Pond 8,000 years ago left no descendants that science can currently identify. They did not blend into surrounding populations. They did not gradually merge with neighboring tribes. They simply stopped existing. An entire people. Their culture, their language, their bloodline, their knowledge, their fabric weaving technology, their spiritual practices, their names, their songs, all of it gone, utterly erased from the human family tree. But here's where it gets even more complex, because not all of the DNA told the same story, and the additional layers of the genetic analysis opened questions that are even harder to answer than the ones they closed. Dr. Joseph Lawrence from the Coriell Institute for Medical Research was searching for the DNA markers typical of Native Americans in the DNA samples taken from the bones of 5 individuals from Windover. He did not find what he was looking for. After comparing the Windover DNA to present European populations, he said, "I went back to the screen and I looked at the sequences again. The first person's DNA, it looked European. When I looked at the second one, it looked European. When I looked at the third, fourth, and fifth, it was slightly different from the first two, but they still looked European. European. The DNA, at least portions of it, at least in the mitochondrial analysis, carried patterns more characteristic of European lineages than of the Asian-derived haplogroups that defined virtually every other ancient and modern Native American population ever studied. Dr. Lawrence was not looking for this. He was looking for the markers he expected to find. He found something else entirely, something that, depending on how you interpret it, either represents a lost branch of early human migration history or opens a door into territory that archaeology has been reluctant to step through. Dr. Gregory from Cornell also stated that DNA samples taken from the brains of the Bog people show European origin. His final conclusion was, since the haplogroup frequency distribution of the prehistoric Windover population is unlike that of any known surviving or prehistoric group, they may represent the only demonstrated instance of the recent extinction of a group of Native Americans with no close surviving relatives. The only demonstrated instance of a group with no close surviving relatives in the entire history of North American archaeology. Think about the weight of that statement. Thousands of archaeological sites have been excavated across the Americas. Hundreds of ancient populations have been studied. And of all of them, only the Windover people have produced a genetic signature so distinct, so unconnected to any other group, that scientists concluded they represent a lineage that was entirely wiped from the human record. This leaves one of two possibilities. Either their descendants died out, or their population experienced a severe genetic bottleneck before the markers we find in modern humans evolved. Either they were extinguished, completely, without a trace, without a single surviving genetic line, or they were reduced to such a small remnant that whatever few survivors remained left no detectable mark on the genetic pool of the populations that followed them. Both possibilities are catastrophic. Both imply that something ended this people. Disease, climate shift, conflict, some form of collapse that archaeology has not yet identified, that left no visible record in the archaeological sites that surround Windover, and that removed an entire civilization from existence so completely that only a Florida pond, an oxygen-free peat environment, and one careful backhoe operator preserved even a whisper of their existence. What most people are not seeing is the broader implication of this genetic orphan status. When a people disappear from the genetic record without leaving descendants, it does not just mean they died. It means they were, in some sense, erased. And in North America 8,000 years ago, in a landscape that supported rich, diverse, flourishing human communities, the erasure of an entire population is not a natural inevitability. It is a consequence of something dramatic, something that the existing archaeological record around Windover does not currently explain. And the mystery does not end with genetics, because the archaeology itself raises questions that the DNA only deepens. According to Glenn Doran, the lead archaeologist who excavated Windover, the mortuary pattern suggests a belief in an afterlife where the dead would need their earthly possessions. This is a sophisticated theological concept. The idea that the dead continue to exist in some form, that they will need their tools, their jewelry, their finest garments. This requires not just belief, but a developed cosmology, a structured understanding of the universe that includes what lies beyond death. 8,000 years ago, this kind of theological complexity was not common. It was not universal. Most prehistoric communities practiced far simpler forms of burial, if they practiced formal burial at all. Another striking difference between the Windover Bog people and their European counterparts is that none of the Floridians suffered violent deaths. No trauma, no evidence of conflict. No signs of the kind of violence that appears, with grim regularity, at archaeological sites around the world. These people lived without war, or at least without the kind of lethal violence that leaves marks on bone. And they died of disease, of age, of accident. And they were carried to the water with ceremony and love and the finest things their community could provide. The bodies include men, women, and children. Roughly half of the bodies were younger than 20 years old when they died, but some were well over 70 years old. 70 years old in prehistoric Florida 8,000 years ago. That is a staggering lifespan for the era. That speaks to a community with sufficient nutrition, sufficient medical knowledge, or at least sufficient care, to sustain its elderly members through decades of life. Someone had to feed the old, someone had to carry the injured, someone had to care for the sick children. This was not a group of individuals in mere survival mode. This was a community that valued its members and maintained them. A community with what we might, without embarrassment, call compassion built into its social structure. The DNA of these people is easily distinguished from all other ethnic groups. DNA shows that they had not interbred outside of their own tribe, suggesting that in this age it was perhaps rare to come into contact with other tribes. They were isolated, not by geography. Florida is a peninsula, not an island, but by choice or by circumstance. For generations, perhaps for centuries before the period represented by the Windover burials, these people maintained genetic insularity. They did not mix with neighbors, whether this was cultural, a deliberate avoidance of outside contact, perhaps even a taboo, or geographic, whether the Florida landscape of 8,000 years ago was simply sparse enough that other groups were rarely encountered is unknown. What is known is that the genetic record shows a closed population, a tight community, of people who lived generation after generation, almost entirely within their own bloodline. And this creates one of the most haunting elements of the entire Windover story. Because if they were genetically isolated, if they did not interbreed, did not expand, did not integrate, then when the end came, there was no buffer, no extended network of related peoples to absorb survivors, no distant cousins who carried the same haplogroup in a different territory. When the Windover people ceased to exist, their entire genetic legacy ceased with them. The line ended completely in a Florida bog. Genetic windows into the site tell us that these ancient people had little contact with outside groups, which is reflected in their genetic similarity, a similarity that, paradoxically, also makes their total absence from the modern gene pool all the more inexplicable. Here is a population genetically coherent enough to show clear shared ancestry across 177 individuals. Here is a community that practiced the same burial rituals for over a century. Here is a culture sophisticated enough to produce the oldest woven fabric in the Americas, to construct elaborate underwater burial systems, to develop a theology of the afterlife, to maintain elderly members, to live largely without violence. And all of that, every single trace of it, is gone, except for what the pond preserved, except for the bones, the brains, the fabric, the DNA. The real story is this. Windover is not just an archaeological site. It is a warning. It is proof that human civilizations, complex, sophisticated, spiritually developed, technically capable human civilizations, can disappear from Earth so completely that only an accident of geology and a conscientious construction worker separated their entire existence from total oblivion. If Steve Vanderjagt had covered those bones in 1982, we would have no idea these people ever existed. None. They would be as absent from history as every other vanished culture that never had the luck of a preserving bog and a curious man with a backhoe. The Windover bog bodies were mostly buried in a flexed position on their sides, sinking to a depth of around 1 meter, where they would sit undisturbed for 7,000 to 8,000 years. The conditions of the bog preserved the remains so well that Windover is considered the most extensively characterized wet site with regards to ancient human DNA, the most extensively characterized in the world, not in North America, in the world. The site that has yielded more successfully analyzed ancient human DNA than any other waterlogged archaeological site on the planet is a quiet Florida pond in a suburban neighborhood, a pond that almost became the foundation of somebody's driveway. The excavation itself was a logistical marvel. Researchers developed a demucking system and installed 158 well points around the pond's edge to move some water away from the site. They also used wooden tools to slowly and carefully scrape away at the peat that was stuck to the bones. Sharpened shovels and trowels were used, but wooden chopsticks from nearby Chinese restaurants were what worked best for the job. Chopsticks. 8,000 years of history, carefully excavated with disposable chopsticks from a nearby restaurant, because the standard tools were too blunt, too clumsy, too aggressive for the delicacy required. The archaeologists learned quickly that this site would not tolerate impatience. It would not yield its secrets to force. It demanded care. The same care, it seems, that the Windover people themselves had once lavished on their dead. Today, the Windover bog bodies are curated by the Florida Department of State, while reburial of the remains was considered. The tribes determined to be culturally affiliated with the site unanimously agreed to allow the state to maintain guardianship in perpetuity for the benefit of future research. And study of the bones and artifacts continues to yield new insights. The research is ongoing, the story is not finished, and as DNA sequencing technology advances, as the tools available to ancient genomics researchers become exponentially more powerful than anything that existed when the Windover samples were first analyzed, there is every reason to believe that future analysis will produce results that are even more surprising, even more challenging, even more difficult to fit into the established story of who was here first and where they came from. Advanced sequencing technologies today could extract far more data, full genomes, disease markers, even physical traits. Yet funding and access remain limited. The site, designated a National Historic Landmark, symbolizes both triumph and frustration in archaeology, a treasure trove whose deepest secrets resist easy unlocking. This is the part that deserves more attention than it receives. The technology to potentially answer some of the deepest questions about the Windover people, questions about their origins, their migrations, their relationship to other ancient populations, the precise nature of the haplogroups that made their DNA look European to multiple independent researchers, exists right now. Modern whole genome sequencing can extract and reconstruct genetic information that was simply inaccessible to the tools of the 1990s and early 2000s, when most of the original DNA analysis was conducted. The capacity to know more is real and present. What is lacking is the funding and the will to push through the remaining barriers of fragile sample preservation and institutional inertia. And that institutional inertia is itself a story worth telling. Because the Windover findings, particularly the DNA results suggesting European patterned haplogroups in an 8,000-year-old North American population, do not sit comfortably within the accepted framework of American prehistory. The dominant narrative, the one that appears in textbooks and museum exhibits and documentary films, is that the Americas were populated by a single migration wave, or perhaps a small number of migration waves, from Asia via the Bering Land Bridge at the end of the last ice age. The Clovis people, whose distinctive stone tools appear across North America starting around 13,000 years ago, were long considered the first Americans. That model has been under sustained challenge for years from archaeological sites like Monteverde in Chile that predate Clovis by thousands of years, from coastal migration theories, from new genetic research suggesting multiple founding populations. But the Windover results add a different kind of complexity. The possibility that among the earliest inhabitants of the Americas was a population carrying genetic signatures that look, by modern analytical standards, European in origin. This does not necessarily mean what it might sound like. The haplogroup X lineage, which appears in both some ancient Native American populations and some European populations, is understood by most geneticists as evidence of a shared deep ancestry, a population that existed perhaps 40,000 years ago in Western Eurasia, and sent branches in multiple directions, some toward Europe, some toward the Americas. The Windover people may have been part of that ancient Western Eurasian dispersal that reached the Americas through a route or at a time that the standard-bearing land bridge model does not fully account for. Time estimates for the arrival of haplogroup X in North America are 12,000 to 36,000 years ago, depending on the number of assumed founders, supporting the conclusion that the peoples harboring haplogroup X were among the very earliest to reach the Americas. If the Windover people carried haplogroup X lineages, it would place their ancestral migration to the Americas potentially tens of thousands of years before the Clovis tradition. It would mean they were among the very first humans to stand on American soil, ancient beyond ancient, predecessors to the predecessors, the oldest layer of a human story that we are still only beginning to read. And yet they are gone. That is the paradox that the Windover site cannot resolve, only deepen. The oldest Americans, or among the oldest, depending on which genetic interpretation you accept, left no living descendants. The people who were here first, who developed the first textile tradition in the Americas, who built an elaborate spiritual culture around a Florida pond, who lived healthy and largely peaceful lives for generations, they did not seed the populations that followed them. They ended. And the populations that came after them, or arose around them, built a completely different genetic story. A story that continues in the living communities of Native Americans today. A story that Windover stands completely apart from. There are almost certainly other similar bogs containing bodies in Florida, but whether a find the size of Windover will ever occur again remains to be seen. This is the quiet conclusion that many archaeologists arrive at when pressed on the subject, and it is worth sitting with. If Windover is not unique in its geological conditions, if other Florida bogs created similar oxygen-free preservation environments, then there may be more sites, more people, more lost populations, preserved in the mud, waiting for another accident of construction and human conscience to bring them to light. We may have found one thread of a much larger tapestry. We may have glimpsed one population in what was once a diverse, complex, multi-lineage human landscape that was subsequently reduced by climate change, by disease, by the pressures of population movement and competition, to a much simpler genetic story. Or we may have found the only survivors, the only remnant of a broader culture that was already dying when Windover became its sacred place. The pond, and as a final refuge, not just spiritually, but literally. A shrinking people bringing their dead to the one place that felt eternal, that felt beyond the reach of whatever was ending them, that felt like it might hold their memory even when nothing else did. And it did. For 8,000 years it held them. It kept their brains intact. It preserved their fabric and their jewelry and their tools and their DNA. It waited until the machines of a new civilization arrived at its edge and gave them, at last, back to the world. The water is still now. The pond sits quiet in its Titusville neighborhood. Children probably ride their bikes past it. People walk their dogs along its edges. They do not know what is below. They do not know that the scientific questions those depths contain have not been answered. That the genome of the Windover people remains only partially sequenced. That the full story of who they were and where they came from and what ended them is still, in the most literal sense, locked in the peat. They do not know that the oldest fabric in the Americas was woven just below their feet. They do not know that 91 preserved human brains once spent 8 millennia in the mud beneath their neighborhood. But the question that ought to keep every one of us awake, the question that the DNA of the Windover people demands, that science has not yet found the courage or the funding to fully answer, is this. If a civilization this sophisticated, this spiritually developed, this genetically distinct, could vanish so completely that we found them only by accident and still do not know what destroyed them, then what does that tell us about the fragility of civilizations in general? What does it tell us about how many others have come and gone, leaving no Florida bog to preserve their memory, no lucky backhoe operator to stop and make the call? The Windover people are gone, but the pond remembers, and the DNA, still waiting for technology powerful enough to read its deepest secrets, is not finished talking.